those are anything before we get started. I think that should be nothing yet. So yeah, like I said, we're going to be talking about Economics 101, specifically how to debate economics in world schools debate. So we're going to be talking about all these all these concepts, not a whole lot of material. It looks like a lot, but we're not going to go super in depth into any one thing. But before that, we'll just watch this.
Oh, we can hear it.
You can't hear it?
No.
No. Okay, well, I'll just explain the video. I don't know how to turn on the audio then. And okay, essentially the video is just going to be talking about economics is just the concept of how do we allocate scarce resources. So that's pretty much the underlying concept of economics. A lot of people think it's about specifically policy or how do we do X, Y, Z, but at the most fundamental level, it's just the basic concept that there's only a finite amount of resources in the world, and countries have to figure out how to allocate those resources, how to use those resources in a way that maximizes their own output, their own ability to produce products. So fundamentally, that's what economics is about. I think that debating econ, specifically from a judge's perspective, is really important to know, considering all the rounds I've watched about economics that I have not been the biggest fan of, and I'll tell you why. Debaters have a hard time with economics topics for a couple of reasons. First of all, sometimes they just don't understand the topic. I remember watching a debate my senior year in at an international tournament. So it was a pretty big debate. It was literally finals of the tournament, and one side of the team did not understand the topic coming into the round. It was about regional versus trade blocks, and they just didn't grasp what the topic was about. So they had pretty much lost the debate before even walking into the round because the other team just knew the topic better. I think it was a 7-0 for the opposition, just because it was pretty obvious the prop didn't know what they were talking about, and the judges' all comments were pretty much along the same lines of, we ended up voting for the op, not necessarily because they debated better, but just because they knew the topic better. So always make sure to be researching for economics topics. I find that that generally helps. If one team just knows more than the other, it'll go better. Second of all, debaters don't continue to develop arguments, and this kind of goes back to not understanding the topic, in that they might not have done enough research to continue developing arguments. Like maybe there was a basic Google search done, but beyond that, they don't really understand what they're going over. So in general, when you have economics topics, research. The last thing is that they're just really dry. Like in general, there's only so much a debater can do to make them interesting, because it's just going to be talking about policies and economic theory. So a couple of tips. One, as I've already said, make sure to read. Two, if you're funny, these are a really good debate for you. If you're not funny though, don't try to be funny. I am not funny when I debate, and when I have tried, it just goes terribly. Something you can definitely practice, but not something to practice in an economics round. Finally, just make sure to differentiate your substantive material. This is especially important when it comes to responses on the other team's case. A lot of times I've seen debaters simply use their case material as responses to the other team's case, and that's pretty much as far as they get in terms of responses. Make sure to differentiate those to make sure that the judge is constantly hearing new analysis and ideas, and that it doesn't sound very, one, repetitive, or two, like you don't understand as much of the topic as you might. So just overall, research is the most important thing for economics motions. Don't necessarily rely on one of your teammates knowing enough to carry you through the round, because if you do get asked a hard POI, or if you do have to make a certain response, XYZ, explain it out in depth, it's going to be hard, especially if you're explaining complex econ topics to a judge that might not be well versed in economics. Being able to break these topics down is very important. But that's pretty much the overview to how you're going to debate an economics topic, at least from my perspective, as a judge. So these are some examples of economics topics. This house would require companies to pay their interns, pretty obvious, and that it's just going to increase wages. This house believes that after meeting their basic needs, individuals have a moral responsibility to donate their wealth towards poverty alleviation. So this would be a combination of a principled or moral motion alongside like economic policy. Though to be fair, since it is a belief that you probably don't have to go as specific into economics, but it would probably be more about like welfare and the importance of welfare than anything else. The third is this house supports a robot tax. This is actually a pretty common one I've seen. I think I debated it like 2 to 3 times. Once as an impromptu motion, once as a prepared motion. The robot tax is simply a tax on automation used like in production of products or pretty much anywhere that you would use a robot or automation within production. So these kinds of taxes would just force companies to pay proportionally costs in order to produce products. Finally, this house would ban cash. This one was a pretty old one, to be fair. I think I had it my sophomore, junior year, so a long time ago. But it was in relation to India banning cash at the time. So this one is specific to how does, cash operate as a currency. Something you would have to look up is how does currency in general work. So those are just some ideas of how economics topics are going to work. Now we're going to go more specifically into topics. Micro versus macro econ is what we're going to start with. This is probably, as you can see, not super important to know, just more of a preface than anything else for further reading if you're interested in going more in depth into economics in the future. So we'll start with microeconomics. It's just kind of, it's relatively obvious what they mean based on micro versus macro, like just those words, but micro specifically focuses on the study of individuals or like just like the smaller concepts within an economy. So how an individual purchases, how businesses determine pricing. So very much up to rather individual consumers or producers, not necessarily a look at the overall market, but or like the overall economy, but rather just specific sectors or even specific products. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, is the study of the economy as a whole. So this is going to be more about governmental policy, the value of currency, debt. So pretty much any of the bigger concepts where you're looking at the overall economy. You can kind of see this chart that gives you all the specific examples of micro versus macro. And the way this would be important is either if you're taking micro versus macro AP economics, or in general, it's going to be helpful when you're looking up or trying to research material, if you're trying to find information about the worldwide economy versus a specific company economy. This will be helpful phrases to utilize when doing research. Are there any questions before I move to the next part of the lecture? All right. Okay, so the second concept that is also more of a preface than anything else, probably not something you're going to directly use in a debate, is classical versus Keynesian economics. Classical is just kind of free markets, let them be on their own. People are smart, rational consumers, and they probably know enough to make intelligent decisions when it comes to the market. So the market is able to self-correct itself just based on consumers and producers and the way they interact. And they'll be pretty much fine on their own. As you can see, the theory got popularized during industrialization. So it was really when, there was a lot of production happening and a lot of consumers buying that people were like, oh, the market will be fine on its own. We don't really need the government to step in. Keynesian, on the other hand, says that the market, for the most part, will be fine, except when things start going poorly. At that point, the government does need to intervene because people are no longer rational consumers when things start going poorly because they get scared, they get nervous, and it clouds their ability to make smart judgments when it comes to the economy. At that point, people begin saving, they don't spend anymore. The economy isn't being essentially helped by consumer spending because people start saving money. At that point, the government has to jumpstart the economy through taxes by collecting money and redistributing wealth. They have to figure out ways to implement policies to stimulate demand. As you can see, it also got famous after the Great Depression. So pretty obvious reasoning as to why one might believe this argument is because, you know, the economy went so poorly and the government really did have to step in a significant amount in order to improve it through policies like creating jobs or welfare programs, etc. So once again, this is a more general concept. If something you want to look specifically into, feel free to do so, but probably not something you're going to be getting like an impromptu motion on, like, you know, do you prefer classical or Keynesian? All right. This is one thing that you'll actually, this is where we're just going to get to topics you're actually going to probably start using in a real debate. So the first concept is simply supply and demand. It's a pretty basic concept that a lot of people have heard about, but we're going to go specifically and talk about this chart right here you see. So this is the supply and demand graph, a very basic way of looking at how supply and demand works. So quantity, so that's the amount of products being produced, is the bottom or the x-axis, and the y-axis is price. So, you know, as you go up the bar, you increase in price. As you go alongside the bar, you increase in quantity. And then the D and S represent supply and demand. So supply is going to be the curve that's going this way, and demand is going to be this curve. And the idea is at the point at which supply and demand intersect, that's what's called your equilibrium point, or the point in which the perfect price and the perfect quantity for the market at hand is being produced. So that's when, you know, the amount producers are producing meets well with the amount consumers are demanding. And that's the point at which you can price things and you can determine how much output to use. So that's often why people say that supply and demand influences price, because if something's really hot in demand, then consumers or the producers will want to increase their supply, or they'll leave their supply as is but increase their price because the product is in such demand. People will be more willing to pay a higher price. On the other hand, if something is low in supply or high in supply but low in demand, people don't really want it. They're not going to be willing to spend a lot of money for it. So the prices will generally be lower because producers have to kind of push the product out by finding ways to make it appeal to people. So an example would be on the graph specifically, if you had the supply here where it's above the equilibrium point, this is where your demand would be. So your demand is going to be a lot lower than your supply rate. So at that point, you're going to create what's called a surplus, which is going to be this triangle right here, where that is the difference between how much supply there is and how much demand there is. And at that point, people are not really buying that X amount of products. That's why there's too much in the market. This is one of the more confusing concepts because we're looking specifically at a graph. Are there any questions yet about it? All right, cool. So right, that's going to be what's called a surplus. On the other hand, if supply is lower than the demand, so this is your demand line. So this would be your demand point right here. This would be your supply point right here. This would be called a shortage because there is a lot of demand for the product, but there's not enough supply at hand to fulfill the demand. So you're having a shortage of products because you don't have enough products to meet the demand. Are there any questions about the supply-demand graph? So how this would be important is if you got into a debate and it's more so about how products kind of exist within the market if people want to buy them. So based on the examples given earlier, this would probably apply more to like something along the lines of, you know, if there's like we're talking about natural resources and about maybe cutting back on natural resources that are high in like if they pollute a lot, or something along those lines where you're either cutting back on the ability for producers to produce or you're decreasing demand for something. The next topic, these are kind of two topics combined. because I want to go through the drill more so than anything else together, is specialization and cost benefit analysis. So specialization is the idea that companies should focus on producing a specific group of products. So that's why, like a sports production company will focus on producing just sports products and not branch out into other products like let's say they produce soccer balls, and they just focus on producing anything related to soccer. They're not going to branch out into producing basketball products because they're just better at producing soccer balls. So the reason companies would want to do this is that it's more resource efficient. So it's like buying in bulk, kind of. So when you have to produce a certain amount of products, you know which kinds of resources are required to produce those products. That means you're going to be buying those specific resources or those materials and not worry about buying other materials. So then you just have to focus on that specific group and buy those, saving yourself money with, for example, the people you are buying the resources from. Additionally, this also applies to countries. So if you're in a country where there is for example, copper, and another country does have a lot of copper, then you can really focus on producing steel products because that's the products you have most access to, being that it'll be most efficient for your specific country. It also provides an advantage in the market if you're just better at producing things than other countries. So if my country is better at producing those steel products, then I'll be able to produce them for a lower price because I'm getting better access to those materials than, for example, a country that would have to import steel in order to produce the same products. This gives me an advantage in the market because I can price those products at a lower amount because it was cheaper for me to make. Then I get the advantage of having lower prices than other companies or other countries in the market, meaning that people are more likely to buy from my company or my or like the country specifically. Therefore, it kind of provides an advantage because you're being able to either produce products faster, cheaper, or just in general higher qualities, depending on what materials you have or what access to technology you have. This is kind of why it's harder to usurp the countries that are doing well right now because they already have those advantages in the market due to their ability to produce faster. So specialization leans into what's called a comparative advantage. So compared to another country, you have an advantage in producing products because you produce it faster than that other country or other company. The difference is there's also what's called an absolute advantage, where I may be making more products overall, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm producing them better than another company. So let's say country A produces 200 products and country B produces 300 products. Country A producing 200 products produces less than 300, so they are at a absolute disadvantage. Company B producing 300 products is at an absolute advantage. Here, let me write this out. So country A produces 200. Oop, that looks so bad. And country B produces 300. So country B has the absolute advantage because they're producing just more products in general. But country A can have what's called the comparative advantage because let's say every day they produce 200 products, but country B produces 300 products every 2 days. All right, you get the concept. So country B producing essentially 150 products every day, while country B A produces 200. This means country A is producing faster than country B, even if every week they just make overall less. So country A has the comparative advantage, while country B has the absolute advantage. That being said, country B can also have an absolute advantage if they're producing 300 products a day, or even if they're producing 201 products a day. It's just dependent on their level of production, on how fast it's going, etc. So that's kind of the idea of specialization. That's going to be important when it comes to discussing economic policies as related to other countries. An example being a motion you're going to see for the drill. talking about regional trade blocks versus global free trade. At that point, you're going to be discussing why countries trade with each other, and it's because of specialization, because it's just easier to get products from other countries rather than producing everything. Analysis. Before I do that, are there any questions so far? Okay. After this specific slide, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So once I'm done with cost benefit analysis, you can feel free to take a 5-minute break, grab some water, use the restroom, do stretches, etc. So yeah, let's talk about cost benefit analysis. You already kind of do this in debate. It's just the concept that you look at the costs, look at the benefits, and see which one is better than the other. A very basic concept, but one that is specifically done in economics. You use a variety of costs and of benefits, but two specific terms that you're going to be looking at in economics is opportunity cost and sunk cost. So opportunity cost is the idea that it's essentially the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one decision is made. So an example would be, I want to, so I'm trying to think of a basic one. Let's say I either need to go to the grocery store to buy groceries, or I want to go to the gym for 1 hour and exercise. I only have 1 hour span of time, so I have to pick one or the other. An opportunity cost if I picked going to the grocery store was, although I do get to go get groceries, my opportunity cost is that I no longer have time to go to the gym. So it's essentially foregoing one thing for another. That thing that you forego is your opportunity cost, because it's this thing you cannot do due to picking the other decision, or due to making a decision to do something else. In businesses, this is important when, for example, thinking about expanding the size of a company. So let's say I want to buy more factory space. If I buy more factory space, I get to invest my money into expanding the company physically, but that money can no longer go to, for example, research and development. And that's my opportunity cost, because I'm being forced to make a decision for the company about one thing over another, assuming I have limited amount of money. Remember that economics is all about finite resources. So this is really important when considering that, because it means that there's only so much you can do with those resources and how you allocate them, and anything you decide not to do would be your opportunity cost. So an example of something you'd potentially use in debate is why companies pollute. So they could make the decision to stop polluting, and that would probably improve the way they look in the public eye, because they'll be more or they'll be more environmentally friendly, just giving them an overall boost in terms of reputation. However, it would be extremely costly to switch to clean energy, for example, because it'll cost them, for example, building solar panels or creating wind energy, or etc. That is their opportunity cost, is the amount of money they make. So opportunity cost, to be fair, doesn't necessarily always have to be money based. It can be not being able to gain access to improving your reputation in the public eye. But it's called cost, but that doesn't mean it's always related to money specifically. On the other hand, there's something called a sunk cost. This occurs when we've made a decision, and it's not something we can reverse or change. So it's just kind of, we're committed. I hope y'all also cannot hear those notifications, because I'm just getting so many. It's something that you cannot change, and you can't go back and do anything about, so you just kind of ignore it because it's no longer relevant to the way we make decisions. So an example would be, let's say, and a common one that economists like to use is going to an all-you-can-eat place. You've already made the decision to purchase a ticket to the all-you-can-eat bar. And a lot of people use that to say, okay, now I'm going to eat as much as I possibly can in order to justify buying the ticket. But buying the meal is a sunk cost. You've already made the decision to pay for the meal. You've already spent the money. So at that point, it should no longer be relevant to how much food you eat. You should only eat as much as you want, or as much as makes you comfortable. because you're ignoring the fact that it's an all-you-can-eat bar. At the end of the day, you paid the money, so it should no longer be relevant to your decision making. An example in businesses would be, let's say you decided to buy that factory space, and you have expanded the company. Now looking forward to ways you're going to allocate the remaining amount of funds, that factory is a sunk cost. You've already made the decision to expand the factory. The money has already been spent, and it should no longer be relevant to future decision making when determining how to spend the rest of excess money a company might have. So those are just a couple of costs that you're probably going to see in economics relating to how we make decisions. Yes. You can either unmute or type in chat.
Does the property or object that you bought with that money now become a factor in future decision making rather than the money itself?
It's dependent on the kinds of decisions you're making. So it can be relevant if you're thinking about expanding product lines, because now you have that extra factory space and you have the capacity to make new products to diversify your product line. However, if it's a decision about something unrelated directly to the factory space, then it is a sunk cost because it's not really relevant at that point in time. So thinking about like how a cost is going to affect future decision making, I think in general though it would probably be more so a sunk cost than anything else, because it's not really something that's important unless you're specifically thinking about utilizing that factory space for something. But at that point, it's not really a decision making because you're not thinking about the costs and benefits of using that factory space. You're thinking about the costs and benefits of expanding a product line. In which case you're thinking about how much does the products cost compared to like a different product. Because the idea of using that factory space is going to be universal regardless of which product you pick. So another way to look at a sunk cost is it going to really change dependent on the scenario I pick? So if I go with product A, do I need to use that extra factory space? Or if I go with product B, do I also use the factory space? So if I'm using the factory space in both situations, it's not a relevant cost because it's being utilized in both situations. But if I'm only using it when I produce product A, it does become a relevant cost because it's specific to one situation rather than both situations. But that's also more so about relevant cost versus irrelevant cost and not necessarily a sunk cost. So in general, yeah, we're going to be looking more so at the money than anything else for sunk costs when looking specifically into the economic analysis. Does that kind of clarify it, or do you want me to go a little bit more
Yeah, that kind of sums it up.
Okay. So we'll just go ahead and take a 5-minute break. If we're gonna grab water, do stretches, etc. And I will be back. So it's 12:01 for me. I don't know if y'all are in different time zones, but we'll meet back here at 12:06. Okay, I'm gonna give everyone a minute to get back, and then we'll go ahead and continue. Also, if everyone can do me a favor and in chat type which lab you're in, that will be helpful for the drill. Okay, thank you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and continue. I think I didn't really like my explanation of sunk costs, so I'm gonna give one more example to supplement it. Another example specific to businesses of a sunk cost would be, let's say you're deciding to throw out an old machine or to buy or to repair it. So it's not working super well and you're deciding whether or not to invest that money to repair it or to throw it out. It costs X amount of dollars to repair and Y amount of dollars to throw out. What's not relevant to that decision is how much money you originally invested to buy the machine. Because regardless of whether you repair or throw it out, that amount of money you originally invested to buy the machine is not relevant because it's not going to change how much the repair costs are, how much the selling costs are, after it's been a while since you bought the machine because it's no longer at that market price anyways. So it's not really important. Even if it was at the market price, the amount of money you invested to buy it isn't important because it's not going to influence the machine's future ability to produce products if you repair it, or the amount of money it's going to cost to buy a new machine and the amount of money you're going to make to sell the machine. So that's just another example of a sunk cost. But in general, sunk costs are costs that are no longer relevant because they're not going to affect future decision making, whereas relevant costs are important because they are going to affect future decision making. An example would be an opportunity cost, or something you forego in order to pick a different option. Okay, so the last, I'm pretty sure this is the last concept I put in here, and it's the idea of price ceilings and floors. So these are actually going to be pretty important for specifically debate because of things like the minimum wage, rent control, and as it relates to things like gerrymandering or even COVID, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But a price ceiling is simply the government imposing a maximum price you can sell a product for. So even if the equilibrium price we discussed earlier, so that idea of where supply and demand intersects, so let's say that's 20 bucks to sell a product. A government might say, we're going to put a price ceiling and say the maximum you can sell this product for is $5 or $15. Companies can't go above that amount. So on the other hand, a price floor is saying this is the minimum price you can sell something for. So governments will say, even though the equilibrium price is $20, you have to sell for $25. Now, a government won't necessarily put a price floor or ceiling below or above the equilibrium price. And if they do or don't, then they're kind of not making the best decision in terms of using those policies. But they're kind of opposite of your first impulse. So you kind of imagine a floor to be below you. So you'd expect it to be below the equilibrium price, but it's actually above the equilibrium price because it's kind of forcing someone to pay more than the price that should be paid for the product. So you're kind of like going above the price, even though it's a floor. So it's opposite of what you would expect. And you can kind of see in these graphs right here and right here. So the top one is an example of a price ceiling. So you can see that it's kind of below the equilibrium price, which is right here. So let's say this is 15 and this is 20. Companies have to sell at that 15 price, even if they want to sell to 20. And that produces what we discussed earlier, which is a shortage, meaning that the demand, So this is your demand, and this is your supply. So because it's being sold for such a lower price than what you want to sell it for, people are more willing to pay for it because it's lower than they expect the price to be, and they're like happy to pay the lower price. So that means your demand is going to in turn be higher than your supply. So that's going to create what we discussed earlier, which is a shortage. On the other hand, a price floor is going to create a surplus for similar reasoning, and that the supply is going to be higher than the demand because the price is so much more expensive than people want to pay for it, which means you're going to have all that extra product that people don't want to pay for. So, but yeah, like as the graph kind of shows, if you have a price ceiling right here or a price floor right here, it's not really going to have an effect just because it's going to be like irrelevant to the way people make decisions. Because if you put a price floor below the equilibrium price, people are probably going to price it at equilibrium anyways. So I got a question. Why would a government purposely cause a shortage or a surplus? So in general, the intent isn't necessarily to cause the shortage or surplus. It's more about the benefits of pricing higher or lower. So it's not really important to them necessarily why the shortage or surplus at hand, but rather the price. So you'll kind of see this in examples, but let's talk about the minimum wage. So this is an example of where a government is creating a price floor because they're forcing companies to pay employees a certain level of wage. So, like let's say it's $8 in one specific state, but the equilibrium price is actually at $6 based on the work at hand. So companies want to pay their employees $6, but the government, in order to improve quality of life of employees, is saying you have to pay people at $8. That higher price is going to cause a surplus because for wages, let's say, if they were originally going to price it at $6, they get to hire 5 employees. But if they instead price it at a higher amount, like let's say $10, they only get to hire 3 employees. So it's creating a surplus of workers because there's more workers in the market than companies are able to hire based on the amount of money they allocated towards wages. This is an example of why a lot of economists don't like the minimum wage because it fundamentally goes against this concept of the supply demand chart. Another example would be rent control. And this is where companies or countries or governments place a price ceiling because they're forcing apartments or places that pay rent to price at a lower amount in order to save consumers from having to spend exorbitant amounts on rent. So this is another example of creating a shortage because now landlords are being forced to charge less for a higher quality apartment, let's say, which means that those spots are going to go quick because people say, okay, I can afford this rent. If it was at the original price, I probably couldn't, but because of rent control, I only have to pay $15 instead of $20 for rent. That means I can afford to live in this place, so I'm going to pick this apartment. This is going to cause a shortage because more people are going to be paying for apartments than originally intended at the equilibrium price, which in turn means there are just going to be less options to live in. So that's an example of a price ceiling. So that's why it's not necessarily relevant to governments whether or not they're creating price shortages or shortages or surpluses. They're more so invested in the ability to determine pricing. Another example would be Australia. And actually, sometimes they do have that intention. I take it back what I was saying with this Australia example. So Australia put a price floor on alcohol. So they make companies pay higher than the equilibrium price. So they're saying, okay, if an alcoholic beverage normally costs $5, we're going to force companies to pay to charge $10 instead. The reasoning behind this was they wanted to de-incentivize people from drinking alcohol to reduce like alcohol related crimes in the area. So instead of implementing like a full, like we're just going to ban alcohol. They instead implemented a price floor. That created a surplus of alcohol because there was more alcohol in the market than consumers were willing to pay for, and in turn actually reduced alcohol-related crime, meaning Australia specifically tried to create a surplus. So I was incorrect what I was saying earlier, because I was thinking specifically about rent control and minimum wage. So sometimes the government is incentivized to create a shortage or surplus, depending on what kinds of end goals they want to achieve, but it isn't always relevant to their decision making. Another example would be carbon pricing. So this is different from carbon taxing in that governments won't necessarily tax on every instance of carbon use, but rather just force companies to pay more for using carbon. Their goal in turn to create so they're putting a price ceiling. So it's going to be this top graph where they're, forcing companies, or sorry, a price floor. They're forcing companies to pay more for carbon than they would intend. That's once again going to create that surplus of carbon, reducing the amount of pollution being created because they're trying to de-incentivize companies from utilizing carbon or from like polluting the environment. So those are examples of where it would be relevant. Specifically in debate, you're probably going to get these related to things like the minimum wage versus the living wage. So the living wage is obviously higher than the minimum wage. So that would increase the amount of shortage even more so. So economists argue, this is actually worse for employees overall because it reduces overall employment. So yeah, like specific groups so people who have a job are able to earn more money, but overall less people have access to a job because of the shortage of jobs being provided. So that means it actually ends up hurting impoverished populations because less people are able to get jobs, and those that do still probably can't afford basic necessities. So that's the argument against minimum wage that a lot of economists make. In terms of rent control, this might be relevant if you're talking about things like gerrymandering, or not gerrymandering, I don't know why I keep saying that word. Oh my God, gentrification. So gentrification, right, is the concept that rich populations go into poorer areas and kind of, put businesses and apartments and stuff and increase the pricing of the area. A lot of people use rent control as an argument to say, even if gerrymandering occurs, in order to prevent people from being kicked out of their homes due to increased prices, we're going to place rent control. Government's going to enforce a certain level of rent, meaning that people who are already living there don't have to pay as much for rent. This might be a argument in favor of those people making that argument because they can say it's going to cause a shortage of apartments. So people who are already living there don't have to find a new one. That means new people moving in won't really have access to housing, which we actually think is a good thing because we don't want the rich individuals to come live in these more impoverished areas and kind of take their resources and take their land. We're happy to create that shortage of apartments so that the area can't be further gentrified. Then you can also use it for things like pollution on carbon taxing. So those are examples of where you're going to be able to use the concepts of shortages and surpluses and price floors and ceilings to your benefit, even if it's not necessarily directly related to economic policy. Are there any questions on this one? I feel like this is probably one of the more helpful concepts for debate. All right, I think the drill is next. Yeah, so let me check what y'all said. It's not. Okay, so we had gold, silver. Okay, so we have a like mix of labs. So I'm gonna give y'all like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. Let's say, okay, so it's 12, 20. We'll do like 15 minutes. I just want you to kind of, I've given you two prepared motions. So gold and silver have this house supports the Belt and Road Initiative. Black, blue, and red have this house believes in regional trading blocks rather than global free trade. So black, blue, and red, if you don't have time, feel free to just focus on writing one sub. I kind of wrote a really long drill because I thought I would take less time to give the lecture. But we're going to take 15 minutes really quick. And because economics motions are generally prepared motions, I want y'all to just research the motion that I've written for your lab. And then we're going to come back and discuss arguments that each of y'all would make for each topic. So I think that we're going to just go with proposition for both. So gold and silver support the Belt and Road Initiative, black, blue, and red support regional trading blocks. So just research the motion and write one sub. It doesn't have to be a fully written sub, but just like the general, overarching concept and the two sublayers or three sublayers that you would have for the substantive, and make them specific to economics rather than any like moral policy. So trying to use those ideas of supply and demand, use the ideas of specialization, etc. for your arguments. So it is 12:22 right now. We will come back at 12:37, discuss for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll let y'all go for 10 minutes before the drill segment from 1 to 2. If you have any questions, I'm going to stay on the Zoom call while y'all research that, so you can just send me a message. If you also want clarification for economic arguments, I'll also be happy to help you walk through those arguments, but we will come back and walk through arguments as well together. And just work individually for this. You can message in the chat if you want to message everyone and ask questions. Feel free to do so if you're kind of confused. If you have a lab group chat, I don't know if you do, you can also use that. But otherwise, try and like try and create arguments on your own for this one. All right. Don't worry if you don't have like fully developed arguments. I honestly didn't give y'all that much time to write some arguments, so it's okay. But I don't know if y'all want to unmute for this, but if you don't want to unmute, feel free to just like paste it in chat, I guess. Otherwise, does anyone want to volunteer to go first and share their sub?
I can share mine.
All right, perfect. So which motion did you do? And then
I did the second one. This house believes in regional trading blocks rather than global free trade.
okay, did you come up with a good definition for both?
No, I didn't. I mean, instead of a good definition, I kind of ended up building a model based on my substantives, but like kind of seeing what it would look like, but I don't have like strong definitions for them. I don't have good framework.
Yeah, don't worry about that. That works. Go ahead, I guess, and then tell us your model and sub, or whatever order you want to present it in.
Okay.
You don't have to like give it as a debate speech, but
okay. So for my model, I was going to pick either free trade area, which I think was one of the most basic like options, or a customs union. I didn't get enough time to completely research what a customs union is, but the concept that I liked about it was that you could still trade with third parties, and I think that that eliminates a lot of things that opposition would say about completely shutting off the rest of the world. So that would probably be the model that I picked. And the two layers that I had for my substantive were, number one, a trade deficit is prevented, which I think is more defensive than maybe it should be. But basically what I was saying is, inside opposition's world, we see that there's like world powers such as the United States and China who control the trade market. Just taking like the current United States-China trade war, for example, and if we implemented regional trading blocks as proposition wants you to, people in developing nations would see more opportunities in growing their industry, which leads me to my second layer of analysis, which is this comparative advantage. And what I said there was, when trade is focused in a region, countries are able to specialize, leading to more resource efficiency, faster, cheaper, and higher quality production. And further, when it's easier to access each other's markets in a regional trade bloc, the cost of imports and exports decreases, which leads to a consumption effect, which is another thing I didn't get to research a lot. But basically, when there's increased demand and lowers prices, companies or countries are able to meet the demand because of two things. Number one, protection. They know that firms inside of the bloc don't need to worry about outside imports coming in. And number two, just specialization, which I talked about before, like they have the resources to be able to import, export, just whatever they need to.
yeah, okay. That's a really good argument. That's the one that we ended up writing, though to be fair, we didn't run it. But to give clarification for everyone else, a regional trading bloc is essentially where countries have an agreement to trade within an area, or like it can be geographical, but it can not be geographical, but generally it's geographical. And they can agree to trade within an area. They essentially give each other like discounts on products, or just like don't implement sanctions. Whereas global free trade is the assumption that everyone's kind of treated equally when they trade. So you don't really implement sanctions on any one specific country. You can't increase prices for any specific country. So examples of regional trading blocks would be like agreements between EU countries in the European Union, because then they have the ability to like go across their borders with products, versus global free trade, where it might be like, I think South Korea is a really good example. They don't really, place sanctions on anyone. They kind of trade equally. So those are examples, but I do like the argument you gave. That's definitely like, I think one of the better ones, in that regional trading blocks can prop up developing nations, and they can kind of help each other out while pricing other countries at higher amounts in order to gain better access to pricing or money. So yes, I like that argument. That's definitely one way to do this topic. Did anyone else who wrote on this topic have a different argument?
Kind of.
All right, go for it.
So after like doing a little bit of research, there was like pretty clear literature consensus about like the four sort of types of regional trade blocks, and I decided to focus on common marketplaces because I feel like it could co-opt a lot of the benefits that like I garner from global free trade, but while still getting a lot of prop offense. I think something I wasn't sure about, but in terms of framing, given that like the resolutions or the motion is pretty vague in the question of like believing in regional trading blocks rather than global free trade. I think it would be fair for the proposition to sort of like contextualize in what sort of situations this house really believes this. And I think like given that like these trading blocks are sort of most prominent and oftentimes nations that are developing their industrial capabilities and sort of financial output sort of focusing the debate on those sorts of regions that struggle the most from like economic superpowers who drive our competition could be a good thing. It should be like the most relevant actor in our framing. And then with that in mind, my tag was that regional trading bloc establish an economic middle ground that protects the interests of the producer and the consumer. The first layer talks about how having sort of an insulated marketplace between a couple of countries can do things that like a global free market would, like maximizing economies of scale, allowing specializations in specific industries within specific nations, allowing a ton of competition, etc. Because you have a big group of countries that are working together and sort of replicating that sort of free market in a way that has occurred in like East Africa and a couple of other places. But then the second, that would be about how like you protect the consumer by ensuring low prices, high quality goods, etc. And the second layer of the argument would be talking about protecting the producer, which would be where like the primary clash with the opposition would be. You talk about like in contrast to uh, global free trade, the a free common marketplace within sort of an insulated region limits the it limits the places that can specialize and the degree to which economies of scale can be produced to an extent that although there is ample room for competition, there's like, how to explain this? Basically, one of the reasons I don't love this argument is I feel like I'm trying to do two contradictory things in order to both like maximize my ground and like to a certain extent mitigate op ground. I sort of want to make the argument that like we can co-opt a lot of the benefits of global free trade by replicating that sort of competition just within a smaller group of countries so that super large industrial nations can't drive out competition in order to get like a balance between consumer and producers. The argument obviously needs a lot of refinement, but that's sort of the idea I was going for.
Okay, yeah, I definitely see where you're trying to go for that. Admittedly, competition is one of the big arguments for global free trade. And to a certain extent, I think you can say that competition does well within blocks. I wouldn't necessarily put it as like a whole layer of a substantive just because it's more of a defensive argument, trying to limit opposition ground by saying, you know, we can access competition too. But in general, you want to be going for arguments that say we do it better. So I definitely like the first layer where you're talking about the consumer. And I think that the second layer can work to a certain extent with companies, but more so than competition, maybe discuss how it allows companies to like work together in terms of trading resources. So like they're able to access materials to produce goods at like a cheaper price. Like for example, in the EU, how they have like the ability to go through borders without having to pay like fines or like fees to cross borders. So that would, I feel like, improve the argument a little bit, and then that could link into more of your competition argument. But I like the overall argument for sure. Okay, everyone's doing a nice job. Let's go ahead and switch to the Belt and Road Initiative. Did anyone have a substantive for that one?
I've got a substantive.
All right, perfect.
All right. So I was originally going to go for two main impacts for my substantive, but I was only able to get one of them out. So is that okay?
Yeah, for sure. I didn't give y'all much time. The Belt and Road Initiative is kind of a large topic, but
yeah.
Go ahead.
So as the old saying goes, all roads lead to Rome, may soon become all roads lead to Beijing. Back in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China's most highly ambitious infrastructure plan, was revealed. The plan involves more than 80 countries across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East and North Africa. The aim is to open new markets for China and to boost the economies for less developed regions by creating new routes to neighboring countries. Described as one of the largest development pushes in history, the BRI will involve about 65% of the world's population and 1/3 of its GDP. First substantive is economic growth. There's going to be an increase in trade. The Belt and Road Initiative project increases trade in two key ways. The first is improved transportation infrastructure. This is happening in countries like Cambodia. Chang Vernath, the chairman of the Cambodian Institute for Strategic Studies, has said previously that Cambodia stands to benefit from more Chinese investment in infrastructure, such as roads, rails, ports, and hydropower plants, which will increase significantly in the coming years. He has also been quoted as saying the Belt and Road Initiative will also contribute to the realization of the vision of becoming a middle-income country by 2030 and a high-income country by 2050. In a world where without roads, ports, and railways, your country is bound to struggle, the BRI is solving the problem of poverty for millions of people. And I didn't get to my second point, but yeah, that's as far as I got.
Yeah, I definitely like that one. I would make it maybe a little bit more general than just specifically roads, or at least make it more applicable to more countries. But I'm kind of impressed, like you actually presented like a sub the amount of time I gave you. But I do like the argument. I would discuss a little bit more about how like roads and such improve economic growth specifically, rather than saying it can do it. Maybe go more specific into the analysis of how roads like will cut costs for moving materials and goods. And go more into like that economic analysis, because for economic debates, it's really important that you provide that step-by-step reasoning as to how you reach point A to point B. But I think the overall argument was definitely like a good direction to go. And I like the fact that you even gave a country as an example. Okay, it is 12:49. I do want y'all to have time to take a break before the next lecture, so I will go ahead and let you go. But if you would like to further discuss any of these topics or anything we've discussed, I think I have office hours on the 6th, 7th, and 8th. Otherwise, I would recommend talking to a different instructor who does have regular office hours, because this is pretty basic topics. I would specifically, I think, recommend Michael, because I think he's studying economics right now, or Piper. But other than that, y'all did a really good job on the drill. If you want to present these arguments to someone, I would assume you can also do so in office hours and kind of go through it. I know Piper, not Piper, who, okay, wait, I don't remember who has office hours for y'all, but good job. Go take a break before the next lecture starts, and I guess I will potentially see y'all in another elective.
Alrighty, thank you.